Hello, good evening, and welcome to Upfront. Tonight, the latest happening in Afghanistan as we delve deep into the background of what's currently the biggest issue on the international slate. We know that after the U.S. occupation of that place for more than 20 years and the massive casualties resulting from that, as we have realized that almost 200,000 people die in the course of this occupation, the U.S. leaves and there's a huge vacuum, which is being filled by the Taliban in this particular case. The Taliban's occupation is raising international concerns. Already, the international community has a statement out. This statement is clearly supposed to give the international community an indication of what's happening. They are warning those who are currently in position, in the governance situation, in the place, in the Taliban positions, and also in Afghanistan to be clear about allowing the people to get into and out of the country. What they are basically saying is that everybody who is in that country, who deserves not to be in that country, can't be allowed to move out. We understand that the IMF is already placing restrictions on that country. We would also connect the relationship between Ghana and Afghanistan when it comes to the IMF in later conversations on this one. But already the IMF is suspending Afghanistan's access to all funds we needed for the country to run. Will the Taliban be able to survive? Will they get recognition? Is the decision to move out by the U.S. a good decision in the first place? There's more than just that happening on the international front. As we understand, Uganda has already indicated its intention to take more than 2,000 of the refugees from that country. Kenya is in the process of pulling out its own from the country. Is Ghana having citizens or people related to Afghanistan already there? Are we going to pull out members from that country too? That is part of the conversation we'll be having. But more than just that, we should be able to tell you, beyond the international relations and the implications it has for the Middle East, the international community, and finally, those of us in West Africa, what is happening in Afghanistan and its relationship with us? Brought to the lowest level for everybody's understanding is the occupation of Upfront after this break. You're welcome back. This is Upfront. My name is Raymond Alqua, and tonight, everything you need to know about the Afghan situation and the implication for the rest of the world, including Ghana, it's the focus of our conversation. Now, first, I need you to understand that I have a crack team of experts and competent people to help break it down and bring it to your appreciation. But let's get to have a feel of what's like to be in Afghanistan with a woman who was recently there to oversee the elections. She's a former EC boss. Mrs. Charlotte to say.
That's not for any of us to judge. Because,
based on
hold up, because first of all, we'll be making a judgment call without having all the facts that they have. That's one. I don't know the basis of the decision. I don't know all the facts that were available to them. I don't know what they know that we don't know. Personal wish, I don't think anybody could have stopped the U.S. from pulling out because that was their decision. And when you read back all the polls, majority of Americans were in support of America pulling out of Afghanistan. We can probably challenge the how. Could they have done it in a more structured manner? Could they have done it over time? Again, I don't have enough facts to be able to say a yes or a no. But for me, honestly, the lesson for me was this, that it is the citizens that build up their country. We have the responsibility to build our country. You can get the support and the assistance of the international community, but ultimately, it is up to us, the leaders and the followers, to build up this country. It requires good followership, it requires good leadership. And when you don't get involved and work at building up your country, what happens is you would find the planes, the international planes taking off, and your citizens hanging onto the wings of the planes. They'll be left on the tarmac. America, the American government has a primary duty to the people of America. We would like to see them do more globally, but that is a responsibility we are putting on them. Their duty is to their citizens. Their citizens vote them into office with expectations of what they should do for them. we as Ghanaians should be building up ours and not expecting that anyone owes us a duty to come and save us from ourselves.
Okay. But personally, based on your experience there, would you have wanted to see the U.S. Army staying there a bit longer?
I think it was time for the Afghans to wear their big boy pants and pull up and do the work they need to do, especially with the political elite. In engagements, there was always a sense of entitlement. And let's be fair, there was perceptions of large-scale corruption in government, not just the immediate one that was overthrown, but even the previous ones. And there was a disconnect between the governing elite and the people. And I mean across political lines, whether in government or opposition. And it's like they were self-serving,
Okay.
they were not listening to the people, and they were doing their own thing. But yet you expected the same people to send their sons into the army to fight and die. It wasn't going to happen. And so you'll see, when you look at the numbers, they said the Taliban's were between 80,000 and 100,000. The Afghan army was over 300,000. And they're surprised that the Afghan army capitulated so easily in the face of the Taliban's. But the people always felt that their leaders had already sold out. It was only about themselves. So why would they be expected to go fight? There are reports that even the army did not have basic resources that they needed to fight. The political elite was taking care of themselves. So who did they want to go and fight for them?
So you heard Shelter say, who is a former EC boss, giving insights about the current happenings in Afghanistan from the perspective of somebody who's been there, help them to organize elections. But we need more than just that. We need to unpack it properly so you appreciate where we have come from and actually get to know where we're supposed to be heading from the current situation that's happening on the ground there, as international community struggles to find some affinity or relations with the Taliban government it helped remove some time ago, spearheaded by the United States of America. Now, I have joining me on the conversation Dr. Emmanuel Bombande, who's a senior mediation advisor with the United Nations and a former finance minister, sector pair. And what you don't know is that he's worked in Afghanistan before for the IMF. That we'll be exploring in the course of our conversation. But let me start on the phone lines with Professor Vladimir Chidanso. He's the Dean of the Ghana Armed Forces Commander Staff College. Prof, you're welcome to Upfront.
Thank you, and good evening to your viewers.
Now, let's get back a bit of the history. So it was 9/11 that really reignited the interest of the United States of America in getting back into Afghanistan, in seeking to make some level of incursion and control that particular state. Beyond that, the relationship has been that America was pursuing an interest. Recently, the U.S. president has said they were not there to install a government. They were there for a single purpose, to chase out people who were a threat to the international community and the U.S. specifically. Did they succeed in this adventure?
Well, unfortunately, no. And it's not true that they were not there for an interest. They have some geopolitical interest, seriously. 79 to 89, when the Soviets were there, the geopolitical interest was there, and that was why they armed Osama bin Laden to help the Mujahideen drive away the Soviets. So to say they were not there for a purpose, or the purpose was only to get the bandits out, after Osama bin Laden had been killed, they could have gone out. So they were there to install a government that would be pro-American, a government through whom they would be able to conquer the Caucasus and the Central Asia area, and to be a buffer against Russia, Iran, especially, and Pakistan. So the geopolitical interest was what clouded American behavior.
Now, you made a point. To be fair, I mean, 9/11 was also critical to their decision to go there. But many have complained about how they pulled out and the re-emergence of the Taliban and the agreement of the previous president of the U.S., Donald Trump, with the Taliban in this particular case. Was it a convenient agreement with what used to be former enemies, seeking after a failed adventure to get back and leave the state in the hands of Taliban? Was it a good one?
Well, the main point is this, that the Americans needed to pull out anyway. Obama wanted to pull out. he ended up in a troop surge. At a point in time, there were about 140,000 American plus NATO troops there. And the idea was to train the Afghan security services to be able to withhold the onslaught of the Taliban. Unfortunately, and unknown to the Americans, you don't train a people in a certain cultural thinking. The Afghan forces, yes, were corrupt, and they had some kind of sympathy for the Taliban. So the capitulation within 11 days was overwhelming to the Americans. They didn't think that it would be. But Biden was bent on trying to move away, thinking that he has gotten about 300,000 trained men against about 70,000 Taliban. And he was overwhelmed. So yes, whatever the treaty was, efforts were being made to get American troops out of Afghanistan. 20 years of war and nothing coming out of it. Trillions spent. And therefore, the forever wars were going to have to be ended. It wasn't politically good for America. That is why they wanted to get out. But the nature of thinking, if you watch the American general yesterday, he was saying that they least expected that to be that swift. They thought the Afghan military could hold on, but they couldn't.
Now, Prof, I'll come back to you, but there's a question before I move on to other people that is urgent and requiring immediate attention now. What should the international community do immediately? It looks like the Taliban is gaining grounds. They have actually announced relaxing Sharia, but still will use Sharia to actually run the state. There are concerns about the safety of not only international community staff workers, but also the citizens of Afghanistan who would want to leave that country after the massive uproar surrounding who gets the chance to board an airplane and the videos coming out of that. What should be the immediate reaction of the international community? Beyond the statement they have issued,
the international community should be very careful trying to meddle in the affairs of Afghanistan and trying to play a pro-American kind of tune, trying to play a pro-democracy kind of tune. The Afghans know what they need, what they want. Their socio-historical journey towards modernity, whatever it is, has not been made through the contours of American democracy. They've struggled. The Taliban has won. And if you watch their demeanor, it's not like the Taliban of 1996. So they are understanding the international community also very well. They've promised a lot. Let us help them to build an Afghanistan that is acceptable to the international community, rather than threatening them, seizing their properties and whatnot. Please, I strongly suspect that we need to accept the reality of the Afghan situation today. The UN must play a bigger role. I am not happy about how the UN has always been used by the international people, so-called community. That the UN is always trying to play the whims and caprices of the big powers. No, this time the UN has been called in to go and clear the mess. They must help the Afghan people. Talks are ongoing. The people are bringing in other sectors of the community to help them rule. Let us help them to rule. Let them help them to make the changes that Afghanistan needs, rather than threaten them. There is no any threat. We send them back to the backyard, and they will be threatening until they cease power. Every day there was a bomb in Kabul. We want to go back to that. Let us help them. Let us teach them how to fish, and then they will be fishing themselves, rather than threaten them.
Would that require recognition of the Taliban?
Come again?
Would that require the official recognition of the Taliban?
I strongly suspect so. That is the reality. The Taliban today is not the Taliban of yesterday. That is the reality. They've taken over. And they've taken over. Look at them. You could see that the whole area. And the international community, I think one thing I forgot to tell you is that the international community must understand the reality of the area, the geopolitics of the area.
Okay.
If we don't bring in Iran, Russia, China to play a meaningful role, and Pakistan, yes, sorry, these four countries must play a meaningful role in trying to stabilize the area. Afghanistan has suffered so much since 1919. And this is the time that we need to let them have a coalition government that is acceptable to Afghans. The next thing is that we are afraid of the Sharia. Fine. There are theocratic states whom we are dealing with. Saudi Arabia, which is the best friend of America, is a Sharia state. But we are teaching them and helping them to build a Sharia state which is acceptable. That is what we should do to the Taliban now. We need to accept them. There's no way not to accept them. There will be more chaos, more civil war, and we'll be supporting maybe the wrong side.
Prof, if you give me a second, I'll get back to you.
Sure.
Dr. Emmanuel Habuka Bombande is joining us. And I mean, he's a UN Senior Mediation Advisor.
Sure.
Doc, there's an important comment specifically related to what should be the relationship of the international community with the current Taliban leadership of that country going forward. Can they recognize it? And as your statement says, the Afghan people deserve to live in safety, security, and dignity, and the international community stand ready to assist them. What should be the posturing of the international community as we speak? Dr. Bombande.
Good evening to your viewers. And if I were to follow from where Prof. Enchudanso left off, let me preface it this way. We are still caught in the web of trying to solve the complex problems of the 21st century with the mindset of 1945, or what you might describe as the 20th century. And this, for me, is the key challenge as a general observation. And I think what Prof was alluding to was, if we want to be forward-looking in a way that makes a differentiation, we need to begin to have a change of a mindset. And if you then relate it to the role of the international community, one is that the UN can only be effective when the members of the Security Council, particularly the permanent members, China, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, all pull together and allow the UN to play its pivotal role based on the Charter and the founding documents of the United Nations. Now, if you put that in the context of our conversation, whereas there is a full UN presence in Afghanistan with a special representative of the Secretary General, they have not been allowed to play that role that you are describing, that pivotal role of bringing the international community to continue to share and have consensus on Afghanistan. What you have seen over the period, which has led to the ineffectiveness of the government of Afghanistan and the collapse of the Ashraf Ghani government, is one in which geopolitical interests of powerful players supersede the collective geopolitical interests of all. And to that extent, every country is trying to look at their role in Afghanistan to respond to their own national interests, rather than how do we see Afghanistan in terms of the way forward to be one in which the entire human community, in terms of our international relationships, benefits. And that is why, if you ask me, what can the international community do? We must go back to understand that what is confronting us is not about an American interest or a China interest or a Russian interest, etc., etc. But it is a collective global interest built on humanity. And interestingly, today is the World International Day of Humanitarian Efforts. And if we don't shift the focus back to the center of people, and we continue to go on national geopolitical interests, we are going to continue to have challenges going forward.
There are those who are saying that first we should start with the admission by the US that they have failed in Afghanistan, and that would help others to come on board easily. Do you agree?
Well, that discourse fits into the mindset that I've just talked about. Because in the first place, you might argue legitimately that because of 9/11, the UN, the United States had good reasons for the legitimate defense of their citizens to go after the people who planned the terrorist attacks in New York, in Washington, on the Pentagon, and so forth and so on. But once that objective had been achieved by removing Osama bin Laden, who was the chief architect, the next question was, why did the US continue to stay in Afghanistan? It was no longer their specific, legitimate defense of their citizens, but their geopolitical interests in that region. And that is why the other comment to be able to appreciate this is where are the voices of the players of that region in Asia? And Prof talked about Pakistan. What about all these countries in that neighborhood? If we are able to make a comprehensive analysis of this, then we can understand that the Americans were leading what you would call a Western alliance interest. And those Western alliance states cannot see America as the failure and extricate themselves from their collective role in which the Americans were leading, but they were part of. And you can see already that China and Russia are carefully treading along to see how does this come to their advantage, rather than what I'm describing as a collective human-centered resolution that brings Afghanistan back from the throes of destruction again to contribute to humanity, not to mention the linkages with other regions.
Now, I get you, but you have described a very wonderful system that should be followed. But there is also the realpolitik of the international system, the interest-related engagements that are likely to be superseding the collective interest. Who should be spearheading this engagement? The UN or powerful countries that have in times past had very legitimate or illegitimate reasons to have very serious interest in Afghanistan?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's not as if we are trying to invent a new system. Now, very quickly to summarize, and all Ghanaians should be proud that under the leadership of our own son of the land, Busumuru Kofi Annan, the UN led in the General Assembly the negotiations that brought forth in 2005 the concept of the responsibility to protect, looking at global experiences in the genocide in Rwanda, the crisis in the Balkans, Srebrenica, and all this. Very quickly, what did that lead to? It led to what we call 3 pillars of approach that informs a global system of intervention. 1, every government that is legitimate must have the responsibility to protect its citizens. 2, if that government cannot protect its citizens for various reasons, incapacity, logistics, the capacity for resources, the international community should support that government to protect their citizens. And 3rd, should a government be incapable because they no longer can govern, as we see now with the fall of the Ashraf Ghani government, the international community can intervene based on the interests of people and their protection. But what has happened is that the NATO engagement in Libya, the interventions in Syria destroyed the value and the appreciation and the goodness of this principle. And so now everybody is suspicious about interventions. So when you talk about intervention, who should lead it? Yeah. What interest is behind the intervention? And so I would say, let's go back to what the UN has already negotiated that involved every member state and say that interventions are on certain principles, certain ground rules, and certain values. And those values are centered on humanity. That then can become the basis of negotiation on how we intervene in Afghanistan, not to promote geopolitical state interests, but the interests of the people of Afghanistan, more than 30 million people, and how that now sustains peace, security, and stability globally. And that Afghanistan does not become a space for terrorist organizations to take over and begin to reorganize terrorism in which all of us can be victims. It all depends on where you are and at what time, and you can be a victim.
I'll come back to you, but I sure have been putting on hold the former finance minister, Sektepe, for some time now. Now, you should understand this. He has worked in Afghanistan before, in times past as a staff of the IMF and the World Bank joined in this case. Honorable Sektepe, you're welcome to Upfront.
Thank you very much, and good evening to, the 2 learned people who I appreciate very much.
I would get to know about your experience in Afghanistan, but there's an urgent question that I want your intervention on, which is the response of the IMF in this case. The IMF has suspended funds to Afghanistan. Is that a step in the right direction? Their reasoning is that it is difficult to ascertain who is currently in charge of the country, even though everybody knows it's the Taliban, to be clear, and the structures will make it difficult for them to cooperate with that country. At this point, will the country be able to survive with the current relations strained between them and the IMF?
Yeah, before I come to that question, if you permit me, let me just say that I'm not going to restate everything that has been said.
Okay.
But to say that you are looking at Afghanistan, as the experts have pointed out, where first in a geopolitical context, which is very important. Because remember, before the U.S. met its nemesis in the last, few days, it was the Russians. At the time I visited, Afghanistan, you will be shown half of Kabul, the city, which was completely bombed, to ashes, right? So it isn't as though this is the only world power that has, met its nemesis. And you can therefore see, that the issue, the second context is what has also been pointed out, the regional context. And let's remember that, similar to Africa, across the border from Afghanistan, our brothers and sisters, the Pashtuns. And we should not forget that, even within the government that has fallen, there are Pashtuns, including prominent ones, some of them who are now playing mediation role, right? And therefore, I think it's very important, not to, overlook the fact that there are regional, I think it was Ombade who mentioned, the role of Iran, Iran, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia in that context. And therefore, there's a religious context to what is also, going on. Yeah, that is happening. And so let me just limit myself because it has been said. I just wanted to bring to perspective the regional context, the religious context, and the sort of tribal context. It means that we are talking about, and then there's an overall passion, history, rich history that goes behind this thing. So it's a very complex situation that is being, Now, when you talk about IMF or the World Bank, remember the IMF and the World Bank also have boards, which are no different from the UN, right? And therefore, again, you come back into geopolitics. The decision would have been taken at the board of the IMF, where the majority, in terms of the governorship and everything is, the US and the Western powers. And of course, China is also there now, not so much, Russia. So you will see what, in terms of security and in terms of humanitarian, the UN Security Council also playing, out there. And so long as there's, no, in terms of the Taliban, which has been in power before, left, and then you have the new government, it needs a recognition, and therefore that is the point, of the IMF, right? Who is in charge? Because it's a lot of resources. The amount that we are talking about is the equivalent of Ghana's 1 billion. You remember recently we were told that there was a capital appreciation of the World Bank, of the IMF, which happens occasionally in the context of COVID. And we are awaiting 1 billion, which are said to be an issue for Parliament, to decide. But that is, so that is the resources that we are talking about. Then when you talk about US investments in the place, economic, security, there were significant contributions to the economy from the US. You must also remember that there were significant contributions, from the World Bank and the IMF over the 20 years that we are talking about, which is the context in which some of us, went to Afghanistan, not just, proud to the Russian and even during the Russian, because it's an engagement. They are members, of the World Bank and the IMF. And in this context, let me mention that the president, Ashraf Ghani, who just left, was actually left his role at the World Bank, to go and help, with the rehabilitation after the Taliban fell. And he was on the coordinating committee at the time. In fact, those of us who worked on the economic side, he was a key person and then became the finance minister, before the president. So we are looking at, somebody who also has some deep insights into, geopolitics. So I hope, I've shown the going into the economy where
Okay.
we played a role, you know, and then the security as well as the political and others. I just want to say that we are dealing, you know, with a complex situation. And I agree with Charlotte. Ultimately, it is about the Afghans, you know, to come to a consensus because of the differences that I'm talking about, you know. And therefore, I would hope that out of this, you know, victory, defeat from, you know, and again, as I said, a dominant Pashtun and whatever, other, you know, some common Afghan interests will emerge. And that may probably account, it is early days yet, but that may account for probably the toning down, you know, or what is perceived now to be the toning down, you know, of, you know, even the Taliban, you know, in a more reconciliatory tone in the last 2 days than would have been the case, you know, when some of us, you know, were going to Afghanistan. Of course, there was a question of whether it's going to continue to be the playground, which is where the September 11 came about, you know, which is the bombing of the World Trade Center, you know, and, you know, other groups, you know, which the U.S. and others perceive to be, you know, destabilizing forces when it comes to, you know, global interests.
Very well. Yeah. Now, I would want to come to you, Professor Chidanso, because there is a question about who is doing what immediately. Now, Uganda says, being a place with a huge number of refugees already, its government has made plans to take in some 2,000 refugees. Apparently, this was on the insistence of the U.S. government and some negotiation going through that. We understand that other African countries, including Kenya, has extended to the people of Afghan, if they need help, some hand that requires them to get them the requisite help. But more importantly, they have also insisted that any resident of Kenya or citizen who requires to be brought back to Kenya will be aided immediately. In fact, it's gone ahead to identify the numbers involved. Is that a step Ghana should be looking at immediately? Should we equally be asking citizens who might have found themselves working with international bodies to come home without aid? Can we go and evacuate them? Prof, I see if you can hear me.
Hello.
Yes, Prof, forgive me, I kept you on for some time. I wanted to know whether, just like Kenya and Uganda, we could equally first extend the hand to take in refugees, and secondly, move on to have a conversation about which Ghanaians are likely to be in Afghanistan today, and they may require help, and we can help them come back home.
Well, the United Nations Secretary General asked the international community to extend a hand to any refugees that would come from Afghanistan. Actually, from hindsight, we knew the 2015-2016 problems of migration during that period, where a lot came from areas of instability. And I think that was a gesture which he thought the international community to embrace to help Afghanistan. And I think it is also hinged on the perception that the Taliban was going to be ruthless, and many more people were going to see the images we saw on our television screens depicted or portrayed that kind of thinking that we're going to see efflux from Afghanistan. But I don't think it's going to be that. And again, every country has its own right to see whether it could take in refugees or not. Okay. So I wouldn't say because of what is happening, Ghana should also rush and say we're going to take in this or that. We should be careful as to what we think we can do. And we should be cautious and watch the things unfold. I don't believe that there is going to be that stampede where almost everybody would want to leave Afghanistan. I think that those fears have been nipped by the demeanor of the Taliban as of now. So we shouldn't panic. We shouldn't think that we need to respond to that call immediately, or we should do anything. Let's wait and see how things play out in Afghanistan.
Now, I'll come back to you, but Dr. Bombande, what do you think about the recent action by some African countries, some helping out with taking in refugees and others getting their citizens from Afghanistan? Should we also move in quickly as a country, or we should back down and wait till things quieten a little bit? If you can hear me, Dr. Bombande. Yes, I'll be glad if you could unmute. I can hear you, but I cannot hear you. Yes, if you can unmute, it would, yes.
Yeah.
So the immediate action expected of Ghana when it comes to lending a hand for refugees, and on the other hand, bringing back possible, what they call Ghanaian citizens who are there.
So first of all, in the context of Afghanistan, and senior Sektekpe can confirm that most Ghanaians who will probably be in Afghanistan would be working with international UN agencies, and they are already being taken care of by the UN system. Either they are probably with international aid agencies or UN agencies. I know UNICEF has started evacuating. So Ghanaians in these affiliated institutions will be taken care of. I will doubt if there are Ghanaians on their own without necessarily being affiliated to these agencies. That's first. Second, I agree that every context is different. You describe Uganda in terms of what it has done for itself as a political niche in order to have what you would call global recognition by being a welcoming country to refugees and expanding that to include quite a number of refugees, which has also benefited Uganda in one way or the other. But in order not to digress, I will not go there. So maybe for them to declare that they are willing to receive 2,000 Afghan refugees would be in line with what they have been doing. For Kenya, I know that there were Kenyans working with private security companies at some point in Afghanistan. And they could be the type of people that their country obviously would be interested in evacuating. But having made these observations, Africa with almost 1.5 billion people is not at the periphery of global international discourse. So my personal expectation, which is a disappointment, is that I'm not hearing things from the African Union Commission, not necessarily because of Afghanistan as it is, but to put the argument that we are always taking ourselves out of the international political discourse. And yet in the Security Council, there are always 3 African representatives, though not permanent representatives, but we always have 3 non-permanent representatives. So one would have thought that the 24-hour thinking that is continuous in international relations should have had an African Union statement that now informs other African states about the thinking that is collective, that then informs what other African countries could do. And to the extent that you don't hear that, for me, it is a personal worry. And quickly, my final point on this question is, you see, related to what the very important point my senior made about Afghans ultimately are the only people who can rebuild their nation. That is a lesson for every country. It is only the citizens of a country who have the responsibility of their nation building project. But having said this,
I was coming to the lessons we could learn from that. If you give me a minute, I'll come back to you on that. Very briefly, let me get to the phone lines, because I understand the minority in Ghana's parliament's ranking member on the, well, I'm sure we can get him back on in a jiffy, but let me get back to this conversation to do with the states and their interventions. Mr. Tekpe, you have been in Afghanistan. You perhaps understand the way the people think and act better. When you compare the actions in Afghanistan to countries like Ghana, south of the Sahara, and what's happening in other developing countries, there are some lessons that were drawn out specifically by Madam Charlotte Osei in this case, that states' response to their citizens, states' reaction, removing corruption, which might have actually been part of the reasons why the Afghan forces refused to fight back the Taliban's. What major lessons can we learn from this current situation that Afghanistan finds itself, Mr. Tekpe?
Well, I think the lesson we have to learn is that ultimately, when we talk about the world powers assisting developing countries, fragile countries, And one of the reasons I went to Afghanistan was also because I was among the first people to go to Liberia and to Sierra Leone, initially as an independent expert of the IMF, and then later on when I joined the IMF. But for language, I would have been in, East Timor. It's not a pleasant sight. It's scary and whatever, but let's put that beside. When these countries assist us, and that's the lesson we have to learn, we must know that their citizens
Okay.
are the ones making the sacrifice. And it gets to a point when there is fatigue. And in the case of conflict, there are a large number of U.S. soldiers, who lost their lives.
Okay,
Many
yeah.
who have been maimed. Some
Almost
of them,
4,000.
Traumatized. And therefore, you can see a certain domestic politics also coming in the whole thing. Let me draw attention to another one. This time around, unlike Syria, Angela Merkel, the chancellor, was very cautious, right? Because of the backlash, perhaps, to what happened with the refugee influx. And let me also say that if I am right on my way driving, to Accra just before this program, I think Kenya, Uganda has had to issue some reservation about, that they are not finally, approved. So you have those circumstances. If you ask about Ghana, we have the Guantanamo Bay experience, but of course we also have other refugee experience, next door, Liberians, Sierra Leoneans, and others. But ultimately, it will depend, on how this whole thing is perceived.
Okay.
But back to the point I was making, that when a lot of resources have gone in, as I said, into Afghanistan, and it's not just the U.S. There is a security aspect, there is the military assistance and others, but a lot of significant economic. I know that for a fact because, of what we did. World Bank, IMF, and others putting in a lot of resources. The EU and others, they were all, there. The neighbors themselves, within the Middle East and within the region also contributed. So when such significant resources have gone into the country and the destabilization continued in terms of, conflict among Afghans, then you begin to experience a certain fatigue. And this is why I said that ultimately it may be important, and this is where the mediation, role is very important. What can work? Maybe is it, the more reconciliatory tone of the Taliban. It's true that the president has left the country, but remember the former president and others are
still there.
Among the mediators, I believe, even in the background, which did not see, an invasion of Afghanistan and maybe a second, bombardment and others of Kabul. I was talking about Kabul. So the lesson is, once again, what we receive. And in our case, let me be very specific on one point. We have become a middle-income country. For example, we see our reliefs and others, we see reliefs, we see, grants and others dwindling. And that is because we have now gotten into a certain, global definition of a middle-income country. And that is how you are going to be treated. If you continue to think that these resources will continue flowing, and it was Joy FM that said this morning that by 2024, the government does not see, much of the resources coming, which is what happened. I'm talking about Ghana and what happened when I, as Minister for Finance, on behalf of His Excellency, the President, President Mahama, brought HIPIC, to a close because the flows from HIPIC were no longer coming, the room to borrow. And so if we continue to borrow today, we are not borrowing to fill a space that was left by debt forgiveness. And that is why we seem to be moving back, to a HIPIC status. But remember, this time around, we are no longer a fragile state. We are no longer a developing country. We are a middle-income country. The world will be looking at us as such. So this is the sort of lesson, drawing the economic analogy, which I think we need to learn.
I appreciate the economic twist to all of this and what Ghana as a state can learn from when resources are consistently flowing and they keep reducing in quantum over the years. Now, let me get to the phone lines, and I'll be coming to Professor Nchudanso. But before then, let me go to Parliament and speak to the ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Honorable Samuel Okudzoto-Ablakwa. You're welcome, sir.
Raymond.
Yes, there's a single question I have for you. Is the call by some already in Kenya for their citizens to be evacuated, and they are moving in that direction? Secondly, there is also the humanitarian call for countries to pick up and take on refugees. I'm asking whether you think these are steps in the right direction Ghana can learn from.
Good evening to the panel and to all your viewers. First of all, Ghana will have to carry out a search and identify mission, albeit remotely, to know if there are Ghanaians in Afghanistan at this point. We do know that we do not maintain a foreign mission in that country. In other words, we don't have an embassy there. However, there are a number of international organizations working in Afghanistan. A number of countries have quickly identified their nationals who work within these organizations and are carrying out evacuations. So the first thing we need to do is to carry out this search and identify mission and to see if the organizations these Ghanaian nationals work for are really taking care of them and have plans to evacuate them. They are already featuring on the various evacuation manifests. If they do not, like Kenya has done, Kenya has immediately identified 12 Kenyans who were in precarious situations, and they have been able to get them onto a UK evacuation flight. As we speak, they are safe and sound in London. There's another 40 Kenyans who the Kenyan authorities were able to move to next door Kazakhstan. So we ought to learn from what other African countries are doing, especially countries that do not have, if you like, the military presence, and so do not control the evacuation. But because of bilateral and multilateral collaboration, they have leverage on that, and they are able to bring their citizens away from harm's way into a more safer territory, either back home or in other countries where they are far removed from the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. So that's what we need to do. So far, at the level of the Foreign Affairs Committee, we do not have any information if that search and identify mission has begun, as other countries are doing, and that is quite worrying. That must start, because we do know that we've had a history of a number of Ghanaian nationals working in all these international organizations. You know, our own Charlotte Osei was there not too long ago. Mm-hmm. There are a few people I know who fortunately are back, but you do not know if there are still some lingering on who are in Afghanistan at this point. We cannot expect other nationals, because at this point, you know that countries have fundamental obligation towards their citizens. So Spain, Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, the US, Germany, the UK, name them. They are focused now primarily on their nationals. So we need to be doing that. The second leg of your question, which relates to refugee opportunities, as it were, offering your country as a safe haven for these Afghans who are desperate for help. We do know at this point that Uganda has signed an agreement with the United States, and okay, they are willing to take about 2,000 Afghans. We know that the United Kingdom is also willing to take on board 5,000 Afghan refugees. At this point, for the case of Ghana, I will suggest that we should first of all complete the search and identify mission to be sure that we are taking care of our own. As for refugee matters, I think we can hold on for now, because we don't seem to have, if you like, the systems that, Uganda has been doing this for a long time. It's now the third refugee receiving country in the world. The U.S. has built, and other, Western allies have built quite a considerable refugee infrastructure in that country. We don't seem to have that after the Bujumbura example we set following the Liberian crisis. So I would rather, at this point, we focus more on getting Ghanaians out of harm's way. If it is the case that the refugee agreements that have been signed so far, that is the Ugandan one and the UK one, if it appears that probably they are overwhelmed, then we can trigger some discussion. But at this point, I'm more concerned about how many Ghanaians are out there. Are we sure that there are no Ghanaians there at this point who will need
Raymond, if I may make a quick intervention on that.
I'll be most grateful to you. Thank you so much, ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee on Parliament. Gentlemen, we're wrapping up. First, I'll take a minute wrap up from each of you. Lessons and the way forward. I'll start first of all with you. Mr. Tekpe wanted to make an intervention. Yes, Mr. Tekpe, very quickly.
If you listen carefully to your interview with Charlotte, not much has changed. From when I was there in the early 2000s, that the UN is a focal point for experts who go into Afghanistan.
I see.
And she mentioned the UN compound. If you remember, I have fond memories of that. So the first recourse is as far as experts and UN employees, IMF, World Bank, the big organizations. If we want to know if there are Ghanaians, the UN will be the first recourse. What may have to go deeper would be maybe a lot of CSOs were working, civil society were working there. And that they may, if they are on their own and not registered, but even all of those are required to register with the
thank you for the clarification. Dr. Bombande, very briefly on the lesson Ghana can learn from this. Of course, these are very different situations, but can we pick up lessons from the Afghanistan fall today?
That we must always be preventive in our thinking about how we solve problems. There are so many international experts currently doing analysis. But if you go back to 2020 February, when the former Trump administration started direct negotiations with the Taliban, everybody knew it was going to end in this type of a disaster because the legitimate government of Afghanistan was left out of those negotiations. And now these experts are saying that it is that government that has failed. And I want to argue that one lesson we must learn is let's be preventive in Ghana about how we think about solutions, rather than thinking that we can react when the problem has already occurred as a way of dealing with the problem.
And the last word, thank you so much, Doc, goes to Professor Nchidanso. Any lessons for Ghana finally, sir?
Well, first let me talk about lessons for the international community.
Very well.
I think Dr. Bombande mentioned it correctly, that we should stop thinking in 1945 and let us stop using the calculus then in trying to solve global problems today. And that no geostrategic interest can be forced on a people for that long. And I think America should learn less. For us, we should also know that we don't have to hasten ourselves in supporting any cause called democracy. We should allow a people to express themselves in the way they want to be ruled. Other than that, we create a condition which makes it difficult for the whole of the international community. So Ghana must always support the multilateral force. We must support the UN now in trying to bring about sanity in the whole world.
I am most grateful to you, Professor Vladimir Nchidanso. Also, you heard Dr. Emmanuel Bombande and former Finance Minister Secretary there in that conversation. We had briefly an engagement with the ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee of Parliament. Gentlemen, many thanks to you for joining us on today's edition of Upfront. And folks, that's where we tie the nice ribbons on today's edition.
Hello, my name is Evans Mensah, and you can relive all the fun and excitement on Top Story, Newsnight, and of course, Ghana Connect via podcast. All you need to do is to log on to myjoyonline.com podcast. Search for your favorite show and relive the moment. Joy 99.7 FM, your radio for discerning listeners.
Joy 99.7.